Just tell me briefly, what do you do? What is your profession?
Well, I'm a writer, and what I've done recently is put out a book called The History of Rock and Roll, Volume 1, which tells the story of the music that became rock and roll from 1920 to the end of 1963.
So you've got sounds like a pretty good history and
Well, I've always been interested in the history of music and how it developed, and certainly I could have pushed the start of the book back much further to minstrel shows and early musicals and so forth, but that's been done a lot. I wanted to focus on the words rock and roll, which of course Texas dance halls aren't, but
they're not, but somehow you got hooked up with this dance hall tour. Yeah.
Well, I am interested. Well, there's two things about it that interest me. Number one, when I'm in a place, I always want to know where I am, what this place is, what it means. And the other thing is that the mainstream of American popular music has always been fed and nourished by non-mainstream tributaries. And certainly the music played in Texas dance halls contributed to that a great deal. Not only the country and western music that was played there, but also the brass bands and polka bands, the use of horns. You know, you wind up with people who can play horns, and maybe they're not going to want to play polka, that maybe they want to go to San Antonio and get in the rhythm and blues scene in San Antonio, or they want to be a rhythm and blues band based in rural Texas and tour all the local dance halls for the teenagers. There's all kinds of ways that things that seem, you know, square or old-fashioned fit in.
When you went out to these halls, what did you take away? What did you learn from them?
Well, I learned a lot about social organization in these ethnic communities, the Czech, Moravian, Bohemian, and German communities, and whether they were organized around the church or whether they were organized, as the Germans did, around Verein, which is one of those German words with about 30 different meanings. It can mean team, as in a soccer team, or it can mean organization, as in an organization of doctors or something. But it can also just mean a club. And so you have Turnverein, which does German gymnastics. You have Zangverein, like the Zangerunde Hall here, which is singing societies. People just get together for a certain reason and do it. That's a big deal in German society, coalescing around an interest, especially an interest that's physical or performance oriented. So you have, you know, vereins that write and perform poetry in a bar where they'll gather, or these people put on gymnastic exhibitions, the Turners. We went to a dance hall that was run by a Schussverein, which was old-fashioned German target shooting. In Germany, the only way these days you can legally own a weapon is that you join a Schussverein, and you have to take a certain number of lessons and get a certificate from them before you can take your rifle home. No handguns at all. You can take your rifle home, and then, since you are certified, you can then go out hunting once you get your hunting license, and come home with a tasty wild boar or maybe a hunk of venison.
No regulated militia required, I guess.
No.
Yeah, the Schützenvereins, is that, because we've seen that in the German halls around here, but also maybe some of the Czech halls. Do you think that the Czechs have these Vereins as much as the German?
No, the Czechs tend to organize it around the church, and the Catholic Church offers a great number of social opportunities around its program, and there are groups that are dedicated to a given saint or that are dedicated towards a holiday. The ladies who prepare the Easter dinner or something. Because they're Catholic, not Protestant. The Protestants don't have the saints, and they don't have they do have the holidays, any excuse to drink beer. I think it's in the German Constitution, but I could never find the exact article. It's just, the recreation is ultimately for the same purpose, but it's just expressed differently in the two religious traditions.
When we went out east, it seemed like there were more Czech settlements, and when we did the Hill Country tour, more German.
Yeah, that's where they settled.
Did you have a particular preference on which side dance halls fall, or the cultures?
I was more interested in the social phenomenon of the dance halls and the fact that people who were living in pretty unsophisticated surroundings, like little villages, which is basically all most of those towns were, that they would actually build a structure to have these social events in. And the structures then helped the organizations continue. It would be ridiculous to dissolve the Saints Society when you've got a place where every year the entire community gathers on the Saints' Day for a celebration. Why do that? It's not only do we have a post office and a church and a general store, we also have this dance hall. So we're a community. It's, the post office may have somebody from outside behind the window, and who knows who runs the general store, but this thing is by and for and of the community, which is important.
Do you think that 120, 140 years ago, when they were building these communities, that they realized that these halls would be around so long and have become such a part of Texas culture?
I don't think they were thinking in those terms. I think they were hoping they could make it day to day. This was an unknown territory. There were scary tales of Indians, and these were people who didn't speak English as a first language, at least, and who were in a state that was very much under the control of an English-speaking majority in the capital city. And they made the laws. These people were just happy to be able to make a living and do things like they did in the old country, farm, produce food, brew beer, those kind of things.
We were talking earlier about if they still speak some of the language, the Czech or the German. Have you run across in your travels these communities, people that are still fluent in the language? Not
recently. I do remember interviewing a guy named Johnny Hibner, who was the brewmaster at Spitzel Brewery in Shiner, and he did speak Czech with some of his older workers. And he was a younger guy than most of them. I'd say he was in his late 40s, early 50s when I talked to him. And he was very, very fluent, He would turn away from our interview and go, "Hey, Jan," and say something in Czech to the guy. And the guy would go, "Okay, Johnny." But no, mostly, the latest article I read on German in Texas is that it's almost impossible to find anybody under 50 who speaks the idiomatic Texas German. By that I mean that, like any language that split off from its source early on, the German spoken in Texas is a little bit different than the German spoken in Germany. The best example of that is that in Germany, when you say to drive your car, you say fahren. But that word was also the word you used to drive a wagon into town. And that's how the Germans who settled in Texas used it. And today, when Deutsch text became, a thing, and the car was introduced into society, they knew the English word for it, and so they wouldn't say "Ich fahre mein Auto," they say "Ich treibe mein Auto." They just took the word "drive" and turned it into German. But there are other examples. That's the only one that comes strictly to mind. But certainly, there were things that they brought from the old country, words that they brought from the old country that are no longer used there, as well as you find this. Cajun French is a form of provincial French which dates back to the 1600s, because that was when the French settlers in Canada, who were the ancestors of the Cajuns in Louisiana, arrived. Latin American Spanish arrived with the Spanish colonials also in the 1600s. And it's different from the Spanish spoken in Spain today.
Now, how long did you spend in Germany?
I spent 15 years in Berlin.
And was just pleasure, business?
Well, I was marooned there. It's a long story.
Okay.
But I eventually wound up doing, how would I put it, freelance cultural coverage for the Wall Street Journal Europe. Every 2 weeks I would have to do an article. So I got to see a lot of that, the part of Europe that was my beat: Scandinavia, Germany, Switzerland, and Eastern Europe, Austria, some of that. Never officially went to France or the Netherlands, Belgium, like that. But I did get into where I was, and I also got to do a lot of sort of investigating, because when I was there, it was a very interesting time when the East was still integrating with the West, and so there was still, to a large extent, two cultures under one government in Germany. And once again, there were parts of the old culture that were very worthwhile that the West Germans were trying to eliminate, and the East Germans didn't appreciate that. So I got to witness some of that conflict. But also these places, Silesia, one of those dancing couples up there on the wall, a very distinct kind of German culture because it's quite remote. It's north of some swamps that have people who live in the swamps who speak a whole different language. I think some of them came to the United States too. They're called either Wends or Sorbs.
Yeah.
And they speak Wendish or Sorbish, depending on who you ask. And they have this culture where they have these flat-bottom boats out in the swamps, and they raise cucumbers and make pickles that are legendary. They're quite good. I've had them. But I went to Silesia. I had this idea for a travel company where we would bring Americans to Germany and do food tours, where not fancy food, but stuff you wouldn't see ordinarily. And a friend of mine who's very, very much a fan of Silesia suggested that I go try a dish called Schlesische Himmel und Erde, which means Silesian heaven and earth. And it was pork and dried fruit and potatoes stewed together, and it's the dish of that particular corner of Germany. And we decided that, yeah, that was something we would add to our tour. Of course, the other half of our idea was to bring Germans to the United States and tour them around the South and, feed them barbecue and stuff like that, soul food, and expose them to some of the music down here.
Well, that could have been a good venture.
Yeah, it would have been a great thing to do, but the guy who was going to be my partner and who had just inherited a good part of a $15 million fortune decided he was going on a bike tour, and the first day out his bike was hit by a SUV and he was killed instantly. So there goes that. But it's interesting. See, the thing about Texas that I think this whole dance hall thing is a symptom of is that it is culturally conservative, which is not to be confused with politically conservative. It means that trends don't tend to happen here because when a culture is confronted with the possibility of change, it resists and evaluates. It says, do we really need to do this? Or is there a gentler way to do it? And this means that when something is established, like the music, the polka scene in East Texas, the Oompa bands, the Zangverein in the German part of Texas, that they last a lot longer than they would if they'd sprung up in New York. I mean, there were Germans in New York, in New York City. There was a big German community, but of course they went with Hitler in the days before the Second World War. A lot of them did, not all of them certainly. So that kind of didn't do them any good. But New York's oldest restaurant is Luchau's, which is a German beer hall. I'm not sure it's still open, but for years it was advertised as the oldest restaurant in New York. And when I worked in 1967 at the Metropolitan Museum, my subway stop was 86th Street. And if I turned left, I'd go to the museum. If I turned right, there was this whole area of German shops. There was a grocery store. There were shops selling Trachten, which are traditional costumes. Don't see that so much. Well, they can't afford to be in Manhattan anymore. But the ethnic enclaves, the Dutch, where I grew up, they've vanished, and all traces of Dutch culture. And those were the people who settled New York, and they've utterly vanished. You don't see that much. If you do see ethnic culture, it tends to be from later immigrants. A friend of mine in Jersey City gets to see a Guatemalan Independence Day celebration every year in the park across from her house. I went to Jersey City and landed smack in the middle of Navratri, which was a Hindu festival I knew nothing about, but I was staying in an Indian-run hotel in Little India in Jersey City, and by God, I got to hear religious music right up until 3 a.m. when the cops made them shut it down. But those people are really recent immigrants as opposed to the people who settled the place. Here, the people who settled the place are still perpetuating these old cultural mores and cultural artifacts. Not as much as before. The mass media has been really, really working on the younger generation. But, because I've always said country music died the day when you walk out into the field and take off the headphones of the kid driving the tractor and you hear Metallica. You wouldn't hear George Strait because that was old-fashioned. If you can convince the kids that it's too old-fashioned to be cool, you kill the culture. But that doesn't necessarily happen. It tends to happen in places where there is I don't want to say poverty, but there's less money at any rate. Cajun culture almost died out in the late 1950s, early 1960s, but it became a point of pride to play that music, speak French, and then it did a turnaround so that now there are people in their 20s who are not only playing Cajun music, but sort of reinventing it. They're writing new songs, they're using the old forms to play new pieces of music, and I don't think that's going to happen with polka and brass bands in Central Texas, but that's because the kids have been, convinced that it's not a good thing. I don't think a lot of these Cajun kids got MTV. I'm pretty sure they didn't even get cable, because why bother? There's not enough money down there to make it worthwhile, throwing cable down there. They've got it now, but I think it's too late to prevent the resurgence of the culture. I'm not nearly as optimistic about Texas, but it is culturally conservative, and so it did last a lot longer than it normally would have. I always tell the story of when I was working at the newspaper here in Austin in the 1980s, and I went to see Bobby Blue Bland, who was a blues singer, and whose heyday had been, probably 20 years before I saw him, but he packed the hall, not with Fabulous Thunderbirds fans, but with actual black people, working class black people. I had a family sitting next to me with 3 teenage daughters, and the minute Bobby Bland walked out on stage, they went crazy, screaming, "Bobby, ah!" Which, that's perfectly good teenage behavior, but not for a guy who's like 30, 40 years older than you are, singing a kind of music that if he got on a plane and went to Kansas City to perform, he would get white jazz fans and hipsters. But down here, he was connecting with his people.
With the culture.
Yeah, with the culture, which hadn't died out. And still, the South generally, and I think at least some of urban Texas, still responds to that kind of music because of the cultural conservatism.
Yeah, I can see it with some of the halls, like the Schützenvereins, with them still being like all, male clubs, male halls, because it always has been like that.
Yeah.
It's very slow to change those.
I also don't think very many women living in even a mildly traditional German American culture would be much interested in shooting. But I mean, it's not about hunting or self-defense. It is about, target shooting. So I find it interesting that some women haven't interested themselves in it. They do everything else in rural Texas, farming and raising crops and livestock and taking them to market and so forth. There's no reason why they shouldn't take those long, old-fashioned long rifles and shoot at the target.
Maybe they think it's a guy thing.
Yeah, maybe they got things they do with needle and thread that also hark back to that culture. I really don't know. There could be, they could make trachten for special occasions, or they might have something like the traditional Cajun culture. When a girl is 12 years old, she starts to make a quilt. And she learns how to make the quilt from her grandmother and her mother, who teach her quilting techniques. And when she finishes it, she puts it in a chest for her granddaughter. And that's how that particular tradition is continued in traditional Cajun culture, which still does exist.
Like this hall here and the other dance halls that you've seen, are they influenced? their architecture is influenced in any way from what you've seen over there? Do they have dance halls, community centers over there like they do?
No, well, I didn't see many. I didn't get out into rural Germany very much, and I definitely didn't spend much time in southern Germany. And a lot of these states that are on the wall here are either southwestern or southern Germany. I mean, Bavaria was Catholic, and so a lot of the people who settled here were Bavarian. Braunfels is in Bavaria, and New Braunfels is in Texas. Also, Hesse, which is in the middle of Germany. I have a friend whose name is Schulenberg, and he came over here for South by Southwest one time, and we went to Schulenberg, Texas, because, of course, he had to see it. And he got the town historian on the telephone who told him where the founder of the town, his name was Schulenberg, was buried. And we went back there, and Fred had his notebook out. And we found the guy's tombstone immediately. And it said, Geboren in Hessen. And he goes, oh, good, that's us. And so he says, now Grandma has something else to occupy the next couple of years of her life. And then we went back to the Tourist Information Center and bought 24 coffee mugs that said Schulenberg, halfway to everywhere. And then we went to Louisiana. But, I don't know about, as you say, what they would tend to be would, in my opinion, they would be halls that would be attached. I'm trying to think. Because, see, I was in Berlin, and Berlin basically didn't exist before about 1820. So there were theaters and venues and dance halls, but they were integrated into larger structures. I know there was a dance hall that the Jewish community used that was part of the Handwerkerverein. There's the use of the word Verein as meaning trade union, and so this was the hand workers or manual laborers union. And where else? Oh, there were Bauhauses. Those were largely in East Berlin, but they were commercial enterprises where touring orchestras would play, and they were, they had a bar and they sometimes served food, and it wasn't quite the same as a community building the way the ones here are. And as far as the architecture, I really can't speak to that. So much traditional German architecture has been destroyed or has fallen apart over the years that I really couldn't speak to that. I would say that largely the phenomenon that we see in Texas is a 19th century phenomenon, and that in earlier years in Germany you wouldn't see things like this happening. It was as German society was sort of integrating and figuring out what it was that the people who didn't, fit in the lines had to define themselves through things like these dance halls and so forth. And like I said, they immigrated to the United States, where religious nonconformity would be easily tolerated because you'd be in your own community with others like you. And that's what these things were selling, cohesion of community, which is something that virtually doesn't exist anymore in the United States.
Do you think these halls and these communities will continue to survive and flourish in the current state?
Not unless a compelling reason continues. In other words, if there are enough, say, touring country artists to continue to play them. I know a lot of the, lower level and on their way up or on the way down artists do play these halls fairly frequently. if there's enough of that kind of business to make it worthwhile for somebody to invest in keeping a dance hall up, yeah. If some way to monetize it as a tourist attraction can be found, yeah. But it won't necessarily be part of a community effort or part of a community organization. It would be as a commercial thing. And as I say, the things like language and religion that bound these communities together are very much disappearing. Evangelical fundamentalist Christianity has really taken over a lot from the traditional German freethinker and the Bohemian Catholic traditions, so that they don't have the same kind of traditions that those churches had. So a lot of that is going to disappear, has disappeared. If like in Louisiana, if you can keep the young people interested, well, the young people grow up, and then they have young people of their own, and that way you keep a tradition going. But I don't see that happening here.
How did you find out about the dance hall tour with Steve?
I think Steve mentioned it on Facebook, and I had just moved here. I thought, wow, that would be a great way to get out and see the countryside. And he was going to places I'd never been to before. And I'm really interested in history. I mean, I just, at the end of March and the beginning of May, I went over to Europe for 2 weeks. And what I did, after I spent a couple days in Barcelona, because I love the city, and then I went to France and started trying to figure out the Catalonian influence on the southern and western part of France on the Mediterranean, because that is, you want to say Spanish, but the Catalonians are trying very hard to become independent in Spain. But there was a part of France that was run by Catalonia. And I go to museums, and I go to old buildings, and I go to churches, and these are places where I can learn things about the history of the place. I also have a great interest in the food and other traditional things. I one day was driving to a castle on top of a mountain and went through a small town, and there were a bunch of people gathered at a guy's house, and they were all in some kind of traditional outfit, and some of them had musical instruments in their hands. And I figured that later in the day, it was a Sunday, there was going to be some kind of festival at a church, and that's what they were dressed up for. It really interests me. I don't just go to some place to be there. I want to know where I am and what it is and what it was. And that's my primary motivation in going to places. The idea of spending 2 weeks on the beach is a vision of hell for me, because unless, there's a Greek shipwreck or something.
On our adventure, did you have a particular hall that stuck out to you that was a favorite, or a community that was a favorite?
Well, we did this twice. I did admire, I can't remember where it was, there was an octagonal dance hall that was used a lot by the Mexican-American community for, I don't know the word, quinceañera, the 15th birthday of a girl. And so they were doing pretty well, because there's lots of Mexican girls turning 15, and they know there's a place that can have this celebration that's in their community. They take it because it's probably a whole lot cheaper than going out of town and renting a hall, in LaGrange or something. I don't know, if somewhere down the line a bunch of crazy Mexican teenagers want to do a German polka revival band and start, it turns out to be a hip thing to do in that part of the country, then that's wonderful. They haven't so much repurposed it as they've appropriated a dying tradition from another culture. You know, much as white blues bands picked up Chicago blues and gave the older guys who were still playing Chicago blues a brand new audience and a brand new way to make money. That was a great thing. You know, in the footsteps of the Rolling Stones, Muddy Waters started getting money gigs again. Can't say no to that.
No, yeah, give them a good second life there.
Yeah.
So what do you think Steve Dean has brought to these dance halls?
I think publicity. He's a fanatic. He's completely obsessed. I mean, I have no idea how he got this particular bee in his bonnet, but he did, and that's a good thing. He's fighting real hard for the preservation of these places. He's deeply interested in the history. He's putting out these books. I don't know if he's ever put out more than just the one, but he wants to know why these things happened and when they were made and why they disappeared. That's of great interest to him. And he's also real interested in seeing them survive. And if that means he has to take a gig running one of them for a while, he'll do it. You know, and he'll quit in disgust usually, but who can blame him?
How long have you known him?
I knew Steve back when he and his mom were running the Ostex Lounge when I moved here in '79 to work at the newspaper. But we didn't, we weren't big buddies or anything. I really didn't like the Ostex much. It was kind of where the fourth level blues bands played. But I was never a Stevie Ray Vaughan fan either, so.
Same here. So you covered the Ostex. What else is it? What else have you followed him in?
Well, that was all I knew him from when I was here. There was nothing happening at the Ostex that I needed to cover, so I wasn't there very often. A lot of the people he was aligned with were people who were, sort of marginal to most of the stuff I was writing about. I also had to be careful that I didn't run into trouble with my employers, which is a whole nother story. The interests that the Statesman has, but had, I can't speak for the current administration, but back then there were interests that I was not allowed to write about.
Okay.
And I was ordered to give every show at the Irwin Center a good review and not mention the sound.
It sounds horrible in every show I've ever been to.
The sound there is perfectly good. You just didn't hear it right. Or I don't know what the excuse was. But there were these two mafia goombas and the publisher at this meeting, and they laid down the law. The goombas told me what I could and couldn't write.
Oh. At least you still got a paycheck.
Yeah, I got a paycheck, and nothing happened at the Irwin Center so often that I was living there so much as I was, at more worthwhile clubs where, the Continental Club, Liberty Lunch, Club Foot, Antone's. These were the places I was reporting on, and it was much more interesting. Arena rock is arena rock, and it's really disconnected from anything except the pop music machinery. And that's of course part of what fuels my interest in dance halls, is that that's not it hasn't been part of the pop music machinery for decades. And yet it seems to still be functioning. It probably needs a bit of life support, but there's still something happening there.